You're listening to the Trailblazers Podcast, episode 74, with Aaron T. Walker.
You're listening to the Trailblazers Podcast, where we will explore the stories of successful Black professionals. Join us as we highlight the knowledge, resources, and tools of these accomplished trailblazers to help provide the know-how, confidence, and motivation you need to blaze your trail. And now, here's your host, Stephen Hart.
What's good, Blazer Nation? Welcome to another episode of the Trailblazers Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Hart. I want to thank you very much for tuning into today's episode. Our featured guest today is Aaron T. Walker. Aaron founded a nonprofit by the name of Camelback Ventures, which is a social impact fellowship for people of color and for women. And their entrepreneurs focus on improving communities through education, mental health, and art. And so in today's conversation, Aaron and I discussed how he acquired the essential skills that are needed to become a successful entrepreneur. We discussed a past roadblock that really hampered, a meaningful project of his. And he goes on to share some of the intangibles that social entrepreneurs are needing today to be able to develop and grow and succeed. And we talked about so much more. So without further delay, let's go ahead and get set to receive today's mission fuel from our featured trailblazer, Aaron T. Walker. Enjoy. Aaron, welcome, and thanks for being our featured guest on today's episode.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here.
So I saw and I really enjoyed this video feature that Allstate, I believe, did on you for Black History Month. And in it, I learned that you grew up in South Orange, New Jersey, and had me wondering, what the big goal was for you, growing up.
Yeah, I think a couple thoughts. So one is, when I lived in South Orange, we lived on the last street in South Orange, and the next street over was Newark. And so, for me, I was just keenly aware as a kid, just like the difference between those two communities, and sort of felt really fortunate and lucky to grow up on the right side of that line. And when I say right side, I don't mean to suggest that one was better than the other, but the fact of the matter was that the opportunities and education afforded to a kid who grew up in the town that I was in was just better than if you lived in Newark. And so for me, it was always this sense of responsibility of wanting to do something that really mattered and would create this world where those lines that divide that line that I literally lived on, it wouldn't have mattered. I could have grown up in South Orange. I could have grown up in Newark. And so that was like the motivating factor of the thing that I wanted to do when I was growing up. And I didn't know what that was exactly, but that was always sort of my North Star. And, as a kid, I was a nerd. I guess the young kids today would say a blurred. So, I watched C-SPAN. That was my show, 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, The American Experience. So, I would wake up in the morning, I would listen to talk radio. So I don't know, I just always stimulated by, the life of the mind and thoughts and big ideas, and just wanted to take all those things and understand the world in a bigger way and, do something that made a difference. My favorite sport growing up was baseball. And so, we all sort of have this sports dream. My sports dream was making it to the majors.
Really?
That obviously did not happen, but I lived it out for a little while.
Nice. So you're an entrepreneur today, which is crazy because, I know you studied foreign affairs at Virginia and then went on to law school at UPenn, right?
I did, so I got to law school because before that I was teaching. I was a high school teacher in West Philadelphia. I taught ninth grade English. I started teaching when I was 22, totally unprepared. I got into teaching through Teach for America. And so I did the summer training, and 2 months later, jumped into the classroom. And, like a lot of things in life, you can spend a lot of time in the classroom, but the way that you get better at anything is just putting yourself in the situation and figuring it out. A couple things I learned in the classroom, about life and leadership and things that actually have been influential in the work I'm doing at Camelback. There was another piece that most immediately encouraged me to go to law school, which was just looking around and thinking to myself, every single day, we are asking teachers to perform these heroic tasks to provide kids with a basic education. And I don't mean to say this to sort of put the work that I did down or the work that my colleagues that we did, sort of diminish it. But when I really step back and think about it, we weren't providing an extraordinary education. It was basic. It was, sometimes solid. But the tasks that we had to perform every day to make that happen, it wasn't sustainable. I taught at a high school that had no library. So when I sort of thought about these situations, I just began to realize that there were so many other systems at play that teachers and students are trying to overcome. And so how could I go to law school to kind of understand what those systems were and figuring out, particularly from a legal perspective, how to dismantle some of those. And, I started teaching in the early 2000s when, I think this language still exists, but, at the time, I think it was more prevalent, or was maybe just my young mind was more influenced by it, talking about education being the civil rights movement of my generation. And so when I thought about that, I thought about lawyers and legal challenges and figuring out how come education wasn't a fundamental right protected in the Constitution. We figured out that there's a right of privacy, but even though that's technically not actually even in the Constitution. Like, why isn't there a right to education if there are states who are locking up or creating jails and jail cells and jail beds based on the third grade reading level of students and particularly folks of color in that state? Then that means something, right? Like, if you were saying we're going to build prison beds based on the percent of kids who know how to read in the third grade, that means that you understand that education is freedom. And so I wanted to go to law school to sort of explore all these ideas and figure out what I was going to do and how I was going to contribute to the bigger problem at hand.
So you graduate from law school, from Ivy League law school, and clearly you could probably have gone on to earn high six-figure salary working for some bougie law firm. What happened out of law school, and what was that breakthrough in your career that ended up steering you in this direction?
Yeah. So because I went to law school with this ethos of trying to figure out how I was going to change the world, I don't think I was particularly unique in that aspect. I think there are a lot of folks who have that drive and have that desire to figure out how they're going to use an advanced degree to do those things. For me, it was always about trying to use that law degree to get there. Yes, I went to Penn. It was a great experience. When you go to a law school like that, I sort of, sometimes joke with my friends, like, you just have to have a pulse and like a B average to get a law firm job, and they make it easy, right? Like the whole system is sort of set up to go work at a big law firm. And truth be told, I did go work at a law firm for a couple of years after I graduated, in large part to pay back the extraordinary amount of money that I owed. But I also want to have the professional experience and just kind of understand what that will look like and gain some business skills. And so I went to go do that. And, at some point, I sort of realized that this is not what I wanted to do long term. And in some ways, I think it was God's grace saying, I'm just going to cut this off now, but I ended up getting laid off. This was post 2008, right after the crash. The economy was in shambles. And so it really just kind of freed me up to say, the reason I went to law school is not to, do merger and acquisition deals for big company A to buy big company B. It was really to use this education to make systemic change for Black and brown kids and communities, people that were my cousins and my uncles and, people who look like me. And so, when that happened, I ended up getting an opportunity to go work at the Fund for Public Schools in New York City. And, that kind of put me on a different trajectory, and one that, if money were no object, I probably would have put myself on sooner.
So you come out of this, I'm looking at your education and some of the experience that you mentioned. You're now an entrepreneur today, and I'm going to have you share a little bit about Camelback here in a second. But again, you studied foreign affairs, you studied law, you taught. How did you come about learning the essential skills that you needed to become a successful entrepreneur yourself?
I didn't set out to be an entrepreneur. I think there was always that ethos in me. I like being the first. I mean, that doesn't faze me, or I don't find it daunting. And maybe it's because I was, I'm the first child, between
my wife and I always talk about that. Yeah.
Between my parents and my grandparents, and I had some other cousins and stuff who went to four-year college, but I was the first to do that. I lived abroad in Argentina. Studied, ended up learning 3 languages, and when I did Teach for America, we were the first core Teach for America ever had in Philadelphia. So I was always just like, hey, I want to do this thing. I'm interested in it. I don't really care. People have done it before. And so I guess that was always been in having that
mindset,
that sensibility.
Yeah.
I would say a couple things along the way, though, probably taught me a lot of entrepreneurship skills, even if it wasn't in a formal classroom setting. One was just baseball, right? Like in baseball, you are a really good player, if you're in offense. If you get a hit 3 out of 10 times, that means 7 out of 10 times you're failing. And so in many ways, entrepreneurship is about managing failure. I'm to say, entrepreneurship at some level is an exercise in micro failure, and so I think baseball sort of built within me this sense of understanding how to manage failure, how to have a short memory. You kind of, sometimes I use that analogy in football about being a cornerback and, you give up a touchdown, you just have a short memory, next play is coming. I sort of think it's somewhat similar in sort of skill I learned in baseball. I think teaching also helped me a lot. You go into the classroom, particularly when you're new and you just have this sort of vision of being Jaime Escalante, like coming to the classroom, you 4 walls and 25 kids, and your genius is gonna change the world. What you quickly realize is that nothing great's ever achieved by yourself, and so yes, it's imperative that you be a great teacher, but your kids are only with you for 45 minutes a day, particularly if you're at the high school level, and so they're going to go to someone else's classroom and someone else's classroom and someone else's classroom, and all those things matter, and you all have to be on the same page and work together, and leadership matters. I sort of think about my principal, and who you work for matters a lot. I think my wife is an entrepreneur, and one of the things that she does work in the talent space is she always says that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. Teaching just sort of taught me that, leadership really matters. And so, that's one of the things that we look for in particular when we're, trying to vet for entrepreneurs is, what's your idea? What's the business model? But what kind of leader are you? And, will people follow you? Will you be able to make hard decisions? Will you be able to say when you don't know? Things like that. And then I guess the last influence is my family. I'm particularly thinking about my mom and my dad, my grandfather on my dad's side. They were folks who just showed up every day. Like I remember my mom was like, she wasn't like mad, but at me. But like having perfect attendance was really important to her when I was in school. I remember I missed in 12 years of school. I probably missed like 3 days, something crazy like that. And one of them was because I was like sick. I was like in 8th grade, I got strep throat. I had like never missed a day all of middle school, like from 5th grade to 8th grade until like spring of my 8th grade year. And, I sort of tell this story to kind of poke fun at myself, but also to say that I think it just sort of instilled me in the sense that you just get up every day, you show up, and you're present. I think a lot of entrepreneurship is just about showing up. Sometimes people will ask, how did you get here? And I think there are a bunch of things that go into it, but sometimes it's just about who's willing to show up longer than the next person.
So true. So tell me a little bit about Camelback Ventures.
Camelback is a nonprofit that I started 2013. So I've had the seed of an idea in 2013. And it was really just born of wanting to create a place and a platform for folks of color in particular in the social entrepreneurship space. And I think a lot of my viewpoint has been colored by being in education and seeing a lot of discussion around education reform. And, one of the things that I always saw and I would talk to my Black and brown friends about is like, hey, everyone who gets this something, who gets to start a tech company, who gets to start a school, who gets to start one of these high impact nonprofits, they rarely ever look like us, but, they're always in communities of color. And, I wanted to do something about that. And this is certainly not the first time that I've been, what my wife would call the lonely only, right? Like college, teaching, law school, law firm, you sort of just get used to being in these spaces where you're one of few, if not the only person. But then in this space, it felt particularly egregious, right? Because we're talking about it being the civil rights movement of our time and sort of improving the condition for Black and brown folks. And one of the things I fundamentally believe is that no movement is ever successful if the people who aren't most affected are leading it. And so, part of what I want to do with Camelback and the reason why I want to start is to say, like, there's talent that we are leaving on the sideline, that we are leaving on the margins who can bring new ideas and new energy forth to entrepreneurship, and again, particularly social entrepreneurship, that can have a dramatically positive effect on the gaps and the problems that we're trying to solve, whether it's high school completion or getting more women of color into STEM, like whatever the thing is that you care about. And so, at the end of 2013, I convinced my wife to take the little bit of money we have left and start Camelback. We had a couple folks who knew me and loved me and, wrote me a small check. And so with $30,000, we started Camelback. It was out of my Brooklyn apartment. We said all entrepreneurs need the same three things to be successful: coaching, connections, and capital. And that underrepresented folks probably needed that sooner or in bigger dosages for a set of historical reasons I wish I could snap my fingers and change, but I cannot. And so in the pilot, we said, we barely have any money ourselves, so we're going to keep that to try to just build the infrastructure. But I had established a set of great connections over my professional career and had learned a lot, particularly at the Fund for Public Schools, where we were essentially taking funds and supporting entrepreneurs to build new education ideas. So I had some experience and just some instincts around this. And so we worked with them for 4 months in the pilot. And it wasn't perfect. It was written by we. I'm using it in the royal sense. It was just me. It was just me at the time.
Right.
And we did this pilot and, we told the story of that pilot. And it took us about a year after we finished it, basically all of 2014. But at the end of the year, we raised $1 million.
That's
and
awesome.
That kind of got us off to the races.
That's awesome. So along the way, we all stumble, right, on this journey, as you shared entrepreneurship and the idea of being able to withstand failures, right? What are some of the challenges or failures or roadblocks that you've run into along the way? If there's anything that stood out to you that you'd care to share and the lessons learned from it.
Yeah. I wish I could tell you that Camelback was the first entrepreneurial idea I ever had, but it's not. It's the third. The first idea that I launched after I left the fund was this idea called teacher capital management. But that probably is like a whole other half-hour conversation. The gist of it is that I want to create a teacher talent agency. I looked and said to myself, from a business perspective, teacher unions have a monopoly over the business of representing teachers. So from a business perspective, unions collect 2 to 3% of a teacher's salary, and in return, they negotiate your contract and your working conditions. And that's sort of what an agent does. The political part comes in. What do they do with the money once they collect it and all that? And that's a whole other can of worms. But if we're just looking at the business model, and we've sort of seen in education, just like this sort of sprouting of marketplace ideas, charter schools and, giving people choice and, trying to unbundle curriculum so that you don't have to buy the whole textbook if really what you want is lesson one, and trying to create more market choice and more market forces to improve the quality thereof. And so I thought, what would it look like? If unions actually do have a monopoly over the business of representing teachers, what would it look like for there to be another market player where teachers hey, I want to go with this agent as opposed to that one? As you could imagine, particularly in a place like New York City, we did not get very far. Essentially, we would have had to decertify the 80,000 person or teacher union to be able to have even a marketplace to begin to create the space for the business model and the business idea. And so, I am not independently wealthy and could not raise, money to make that happen. And so within a year, that sort of came and went. And, because I did that work, I actually ended up getting some connections and this reputation for really understanding that teacher market. And that led me into the second sort of business, this consulting business I launched to kind of bridge the tide of having a family, needing to raise money, needing to make money and all that. But to go back to your question around the failure and the lessons learned piece, there are a lot of things that I could talk about, but I'll talk about two of them in particular. One is just getting your idea off of paper and into the real world as fast as possible. So, I could probably pull up for you, version 43 of the business plan and concept paper for teacher capital management. And, at the end of the day, what really matters is what happens in the real world, not how elegant it is in your mind or on paper. Right. And so, that was one of the things I took with me in starting Camelback was, I had the idea, I played with it for 3 or 4 months. I wrote a couple little 2-pagers, 3-pagers during the summertime. And then I was like, hey, wifey, can I use some money to go start this thing? And we just got going. And so that was sort of the first lesson. And the second is, it just made me think about, and I still think about this. I'm still trying to understand exactly what the answer is, but have an appreciation for how important policy is in entrepreneurship. So I'll use a non-Camelback example and then jump back into one more related to education. But, you think about, and I know they're sort of a little controversial these days, but you think about Uber, right? Sort of these business models that are trying to break the status quo and sort of establish ways of doing things. Oftentimes, industries don't only have great business models, they have created like a policy moat that protects that business model. So if you're Uber, how do you break into certain markets? You have to go into municipalities and get city councils to vote on changing the taxi and livery ordinances, and go to the airport commission so that you can figure out how you can pick up from the airport, because taxi groups have sort of figured out like how to create a moat around their business. And so, because of a lot of the entrepreneurs we work with are not just building widgets, but they're trying to build businesses and organizations that are trying to make social change. Oftentimes, they're trying to change behavior. They're trying to upset the status quo in certain ways. And some of it is, yes, how good is your business model? But some of it is, how can you influence and affect policy to create the space for the business to be successful? So like for us with Teacher Capital Management, the threshold hurdle was decertifying a union. Like that's no small thing, particularly in a place like New York City. I remember when I was at the fund, we had supported this idea called, at the time it was called School of One, and now it's called New Classrooms. And I won't go into what that business is all the way, but one of the things that they were trying to do was they were trying to create a new model for middle school classrooms. And one of the things that they had to do was they had to go to the state and get a waiver for seat time requirements, because the way school works is you need to be in the seat for a certain number of minutes every day, a certain number of days every year. And that's kind of like how you move from grade 1, grade 2 to grade 3. And so if you have if you think you can teach math or English or reading in a better way, but you need to work outside of the constraints of, the seat time requirement, how do you change that? You might have the idea that's going to change how math is taught for a generation, but that idea is never going to see the light of day if you can't sort of wrestle with some of these policy things. And so trying to figure out, as we work with entrepreneurs in Camelback, yes, there's this entrepreneurship piece, but there's also this policy piece, and what is our role in trying to work with those issues as well.
Right. So I wanted to talk with you. Camelback is developing social entrepreneurs, as you mentioned a minute ago. And you also touched on something where the things we plan, right? The things we put in a business plan and we put on paper and that are in black and white sometimes aren't the things that we really need to know or need to be able to effectively move a business forward, right? There's so many intangibles that I'm sure social entrepreneurs need and should be focusing on developing. What would you say are some of these intangibles that you've noticed social entrepreneurs needing to develop that maybe don't come naturally to most of them?
I would say in terms of intangibles, two things. So one is just being a really good listener. I think we live in a world and a time and a culture that values talking a lot. But at the end of the day, when you're building a business, you are trying to meet a customer's needs. So really trying not to get too caught up in what you think the solution is, but really just trying to let your customer lead you to what the solution is by listening to them and being able to just pivot quickly to what you're hearing and how can you tweak and alter your solution
to get there. Too tied up in your own idea of what the solution should be, right?
Yeah. You gotta, I think, you gotta love solving the problem more than you love your solution.
Yes.
And if you love solving the problem, then, you're gonna try to listen to the best of your ability to the tea leaves, to the solution that's gonna get you to solve that problem. So you might go in thinking it's A, when it really might be D. And as long as you're willing to let go of A, you're gonna at some point be able to solve that problem.
Right. How is Camelback, right, different than any of the other social impact fellowships that are out there?
Probably the most obvious is just, I think we have an explicit, unapologetic focus on Black and brown entrepreneurs. I know sometimes I use the word underrepresented is sort of like the clean way to kind of talk about diversity, but what I really mean is Black and brown folks. And I know that other people care about diversity and they have that built into their company culture, but I think we're just pretty explicit and unapologetic about that and are looking for that talent. And that's why 93% of our fellows these last 3 years have been Black and brown. One, and then, two is I think we have really tried to create a family-oriented culture at Camelback with this idea that the sum is greater than any of the parts.
Right.
And so, at the end of the day, we want every one of our ventures to be successful. We realize that the percentages are not in our favor. That's not really how entrepreneurship works. Most ventures have failed within the first 5 years. And so, as great as we think we are, I don't think we're under any, illusions that we're going to bat 1,000. But that being said, really trying to just create the space and create a culture where fellows really support each other, where you're in this experience and you're not doing it alone. So we don't call them batches or anything like that because we don't look at this as a factory model. We look at this as we're trying to help individual entrepreneurs, but we're also trying to build a movement of Black and brown people who are, whatever they do, going to support each other in a bigger movement towards social justice.
As you said, I have to think that it's very important that a collective works well together. How do you decide which fellows to actually take into the program?
Yeah, the selection is probably one of the hardest things that we do every year, trying to pick. I think, 80% of what we look for is really around the leader and the person. We have invested at such an early stage that we're not looking at financial statements and, things like that because there's non-existent. And if they exist, it's like, we have one customer because my friend is the person who runs the place or something like that.
Right.
And so really a lot of times we're just betting on entrepreneurs and just trying to understand, do we think that they can take feedback well? Do we think that they have a listening orientation such that they can get their ego out of the way to get to the right solution? Do we think that they have identified a problem, not only that they have, but that other people have and is big enough to try to be solved?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times we're sitting around trying to ask ourselves those kind of questions as we decide who we're going to bet on.
So what's maybe a question that you'd ask a prospective fellow, right, that you're interviewing to understand more about their mindset?
The one that stands out the most, we've changed our questions over the last 3 years, is we got to practice what we preach. So we're always trying to tweak towards perfection. But this past year, we asked fellows to tell us, or applicants to tell us about a time where they had to identify something about themselves that they wanted to change and how they did it. And so it really has nothing to do with entrepreneurship. It's really just us trying to ascertain, is this person self-reflective? Is this person open and honest enough to just talk about what they're not good at? And for us to kind of understand how they process getting better.
Right. Take me through maybe, some of the processes, the practices that you use to educate and really enrich the lives of these fellows, right? You touched on, some of the questions even coming in that weren't necessarily entrepreneurial. I'm sure that you're helping to groom an individual even beyond entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Our model is based around what we call the 3 C's, coaching, connections, and capital, as I was saying before. And so, money's like the most straightforward piece and the piece that everyone loves the most. Give me money. But the other 2 pieces I think are equally, if not more so, important than the money piece. And so, one of the things I realized early on for myself and, I've sort of seen play out in Camelback is that it's often having access to power and to people that can make the difference between an idea succeeding or not succeeding. And so I try to do the best that I can and, through Camelback to take the social capital that we're building and hopefully we'll continue to build and turn around and leverage that and give it right back to our entrepreneurs, So I've come to, learn that there's this whole world of invite-only conferences and summits where a lot of decisions get made and people meet investors and deals happen and deals get made. And so there was someone who opened the door and let me into those rooms. And so I feel like it's an obligation for me to turn around and do the same because it's just going to give our entrepreneurs more of an opportunity to bring it to fruition, the thing that they're trying to make happen. And then the other piece is, it's sort of cliche, but people say that entrepreneurship is lonely, being at the top is lonely. And that's not wholly true, but there are definitely some aspects to that are true. And so, we give our entrepreneurs a coach, they get 2 coaches actually. One coach they meet with every week and the other they meet with every 2 weeks. And actually it's in a small group setting, so with their other fellows. And part of it is just realizing particularly in the group leadership things that we do, is that we actually have the knowledge and the power and the wisdom within us, either individually or within this group of Black and brown entrepreneurs that we bring together, so that they leave not necessarily feeling like, hey, all the answers are out there. Right, that a lot of the answers and knowledge are actually within us and within this group right here, and having them understand the power in that.
As you're talking, I'm assuming, how is Camelback Ventures being funded? Are you receiving funding from like foundations and philanthropists, and how are you receiving monies?
So we're a nonprofit, so we go out and fundraise as well, mainly from large foundations. So the Walton Family Foundation, the Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, among others, have supported our work so far.
In these foundations, do you see opportunity arising within the Black community as far as philanthropy goes? Like, are there Black philanthropists out there that are beginning to seed some of these programs like yours?
Two things I've noticed. One is, by and large, not 100%, but by and large, every program officer at any of the foundations that have supported us over the last 3 years has been a person of color. So I do think that there are a lot of people of color who are at these institutions who understand why our work is important, understand why supporting entrepreneurs of color are important, or trying to shepherd those issues through their foundations. So that has been really positive, development, and, I thank them every day. The other observation, though, is that at least when it comes to principals, like whose money it actually is, not necessarily who's working there, there's a gap there, and some of it is right around generational issues of wealth creation. And so, I definitely recognize that there are just more white billionaires and millionaires than there are Black and brown. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, from a numbers standpoint, that's true. But also just trying to figure out how do we, one of the things that keeps me up at night is how can we get more Black and brown philanthropists and impact investors to invest in Camelback or invest in other, similarly situated, organizations that are trying to support those folks. And, I wrestle with it because I know that, factually, for instance, let's just take African Americans, we are the most philanthropic racial group of any other in the U.S. on a percentage of discretionary income. And I'm sure that there's a portion of that's due to, just tithing to the church. But there's this whole other world of strategic philanthropy and the kind of philanthropy that foundations are engaged in, where we're largely absent, either working there, there's usually a small handful, if any, but then also as principals, people starting large foundations that are, not just funding programs, but moving policy. So, that's sort of my big dream is how do we get any of the folks of color, whether they are entertainers or athletes that we sort of all know of, or people who are more underground, but who have a boatload of money to sort of engage. I think it would actually change the conversation on a lot of issues.
Right. It's interesting. We're getting set to wrap up here, but I have a couple more questions for you. I'd love to understand kind of like where you're going from here, like what's happening in 2017, right? In terms of your plans and your vision for the remainder of the year. What's happening for Camelback going forward?
We're about to wrap up our third year. And so as I think about Camelback in 3-year chunks, thinking, okay, I think we've proven that we can exist and develop really strong entrepreneurs of color. And so for the next 3 years, it's how do we do more of that? Mm-hmm. We've done between 10 and 12 entrepreneurs the last 3 years, but we want to double that come 2018. How do we go to 20? How do we go from investing $40,000 to investing $80,000 or $120,000? Because we realize that 40 is good, but it doesn't get people nearly where they need to go. And so that is sort of the direction that we're trying to head in, because we realize, A, there are people who deserve to be supported that we just haven't been able to because we haven't had the capacity. One, and then when we do support people, we're just realizing that we've done a good job, but we could do more and do better with more resources, and so trying to make that happen.
Right. Is a limitation for you, having the right team in place? Is it having the right capital partners in place? Like what's the bigger challenge keeping you up at night looking at that goal?
We raised $4 million to support our work over the first 3 years. Our goal is to raise $20 million to support our work over the next 3 years. So, that's a 5-fold increase. So to do that, we're going to have to, we've got a great team. We're going to need to add to that. So probably go from 5 people to 10 in the next, 18 months. So trying to, always on the lookout for talent. I mean, one of the things I've learned from my wife is that, you got to build your bench before you need it. So, so we're always looking for talent, one, but two, it's just interesting. Like, I sit on this advisory board for this other fund, and that will remain nameless, but a lot of entrepreneurs come through this fund, and most of them are white and male, and we're like looking at the money that they've raised, and they raised $1 million in friends and family, $650,000, and so you just sort of look to yourself and you say, how do Black and brown entrepreneurs compete at the same level when they start building businesses from the very beginning that are undercapitalized? And so we got to change that dynamic. Like, everyone doesn't get a trophy, and I get that. So this is not about saying every Black and brown person needs to succeed, but we're definitely leaving value on the table.
I hear that, man. Listen, what kind of books are you reading, right now that are inspiring or guiding you and helping you to grow in all of this?
With the young kids these days, I'm watching a lot of Disney movies.
Peppa Pig teaching you a thing or two?
It's Moana. That's one in the day. But, when I do have a chance to read a couple books that have, really stuck with me the last, 6 months. One of them is When Breath Becomes Air, which I know has been on the New York Times bestseller list for a while. But I don't know. I just find that book inspiring. It just kind of reminds you to live every day. You don't know what's going to happen next. There's this part where the doctor is sort of talking about why it's so important to be technically excellent at what you do. And, he even says that technical excellence is a moral requirement, that because it's a difference between tragedy and triumph. Can be a millimeter or two when you're talking about being a surgeon. You're a millimeter off and you're in someone's body, like that could, that could change things. And so, and he sees it as a moral requirement. And so I just sort of really find that inspiring to myself, and try to talk about it with our team some, is that, being technically good is not just like it's a moral requirement. Like, if we're off just by a little bit with our fellows or with our work or with our partners, that could be the difference between tragedy and triumph. And so we got to do the best that we can to get it right.
Aaron, we're at the end of this episode, but before I let you go, I wanted to ask you one last question, and more so to allow you to inspire our trailblazers coming off this call. So I'd love for you to share one action that our aspiring trailblazers should take this week to help them blaze their trail.
It probably just sounds simple, but just get started. Sometimes the hardest step is the first one, but just get started. I think we always, I'm not ready, I need this, I need that. And all those things might make it better. I'm not saying those things wouldn't make it better or make it easier, but sometimes just getting started. And the other thing is just tell people about your dream and tell people about what your vision is. I think a lot of times, and we want to hold it tight, we want to hold it close. We don't want other people to know, maybe because we haven't worked it all the way out in our minds, or because we're afraid someone's going to take our idea or something like that. But what I've often found is that when you tell people what your vision is, when you tell the people what your dream is, people want to help. They help in big and small ways. And so I think, get started and tell people about what you're trying to do.
Aaron Walker, thank you so much for being our guest, brother. Good conversation.
Stephen, I appreciate it. And next time I'll call you, we can talk about Disney movies.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Trailblazers podcast. I'll be posting links to all of today's book recommendations and links mentioned on our show notes page at tbpod.com. If today was your first time listening to the Trailblazers podcast, I just want to extend a warm Trailblazers welcome to you. We're so happy to have you here, and we encourage you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button in your favorite podcast app. Go ahead and browse through some of our past episodes to keep the knowledge flowing. If you're a fan of the podcast and today's content, and you're maybe already subscribed to the podcast, please continue to share and invite your friends, your family, your colleagues to listen to an episode that you think might impact them most. We believe that someone listening to these inspiring stories will be moved to make significant changes that will have generational impact for many others, both now and well into the future. Don't miss next week's episode. New episodes are released each and every Monday by about 5 a.m. Eastern. Trailblazers, jump off this podcast today. Go find a way to rise above, go way beyond, and keep blazing your trail. Cheers.